Welcome to the Better Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. I'm Ciaran O'Connor.
I'm John Wood Jr.
What's cracking, John?
What's going on, Ciaran?
I'm good, man. How was your Memorial Day?
It was nice. It was nice. I can't remember what I did, but... Oh, well, let's see. My Memorial Day. To tell you the truth, I mean, Memorial's Day is a sad day for me personally. You know, I had a best friend, really, who died serving in Afghanistan in an attack that happened right around the time of the 2016 election, right before my 30th birthday. I actually got the call at my birthday party.
Wow.
Specialist, Staff Sergeant John Perry, who was a great guy with a great family. And so, I feel like we do frequently take the service of America's young men and women for granted because they represent such a small part of the population. But I do like to spend Memorial Day thinking about, those who have laid down their lives for this country, and certainly those who we know and the suffering of military families and so forth. So we didn't do a podcast that dealt with it that week, but it's worth it for me just to kind of like make that point now. Even if you don't agree with the politics surrounding an armed conflict, the courage it takes to serve, especially in a hostile theater, is really, really admirable, I think.
No, absolutely. And I also think there's a significant disconnect between the folks who serve and a lot of times the folks who are, shaping our public conversation. And so I think it's important to, like you said, just acknowledge and practice gratitude for those who've laid down life and limb to serve this country.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we should do a podcast where we get into that subject more thoroughly. But for now, I thought it would be cool for you and I to talk a little bit about some of the things that we've been up to lately, because we have had some adventures.
Indeed.
We've had some adventures, that's right. Both had a great time speaking in Oregon last week at the Lynn Benton Community College and to the Civil Discourse Club, which, by the way, was recently given an award by the Heterodox Academy.
I saw that. They're getting to go to New York.
That's right. So congrats to our buddies at the...
Shout out Mark.
That's right, Mark Urista, the Civil Discourse Club at Lynn Benton. We'll talk about that a little bit. I had a featured appearance at the Weave the Social Fabric Conference, led by Mr. David Brooks from the New York Times. That's something to...
I've heard of it.
Yeah, that's right. It's a notable rag.
The Gray Lady.
The Gray Lady,
sometimes referred to.
Is that right?
The paper of record.
The paper
as they
of
refer
record.
to themselves.
There you go. And you had a very interesting conversation with Mr. Ezra Klein.
I did.
Chief editor at Vox.
It was a pleasure to speak with him. He's incredibly smart and articulate, and I think we had an interesting conversation.
Yeah, indeed. Definitely a sharp dude. Well, let me say a little bit about my appearance at Weave really quick, and we'll start at the back end and work our way forward. So, for folks who don't know, the Weave the Social Fabric project is a project that is focused on highlighting people who are doing valuable work in their communities, serving the people that they live with in areas that are diverse, whether it's education or mentorship or working with the sick or people who have experienced trauma. All sorts of different ways people are serving their communities are highlighted by the work of the Weave the Social Fabric project. And what they are hoping to do with Weave, what they have been doing with Weave, is to connect people from all across the country who have been dedicating themselves to a culture of serving their community locally and enriching a sense of shared community in places across America. Weave is seeking to connect these people to each other and to bring broader attention to the work that such people are doing in their own local communities and beyond. And so the hope, more broadly speaking, is that we are able to sort of enrich our broader sense of what it means to share a community together in this country, and in that fashion to sort of transcend a lot of the political and social and racial and cultural divides that keep us from being able to work together for the benefit of the American people, and certainly the people with whom we share neighborhoods and churches and schools and so forth in the places where we live. And so Weave was a really eclectic gathering because it brought together people from people working in community-based organizations in Baltimore and Detroit, people who were representing higher profile philanthropic foundations, wealthy sort of white liberal types, people of color from various communities, some conservatives and so forth, and Trump supporters. And it was an ambitious gathering to kind of create a vision of what a shared American community sort of movement might look like. And on day one, I was asked to speak on the subject of race, which is obviously, something that brings with it the potential for some real emotions, raw emotions.
It's a powerful assignment.
It was a powerful assignment because people came into that meeting, I think, with just very different social and political worldviews and very different life experiences and professional backgrounds and so forth. And so, what I was hoping to do was kind of to frame a context for, first of all, empathy that could be kind of extended across the racial and the political spectrum. And that pivoting from that, I could sort of make a case for some transcendent value that could, or approach that could unite us across those divides. So, after talking a little bit about my own life, my own story and family background, which, listeners to this podcast will tend to be familiar with. I come from a biracial, multicultural family that's also, essentially a bipartisan, to a degree, a bipartisan family as well. But after talking a little bit about my own story, I tried to talk about the story of, say, an African-American person growing up in, say, the Jordan Downs projects in L.A. where I had lived for about a year or so. And to kind of address this perception that, young black people sometimes feel like it's not as easy for them to be outwardly patriotic in the way that it is for other people. And you can think of Colin Kaepernick's demonstrations and so forth as speaking to this phenomenon a bit. And, a lot of people wonder, well, why is it that, some of these people of color can't sort of, embrace the idea of the American dream in the way that some of the rest of us can. I tried to give sort of a full-throated overview of the experience of, going back in history. A young black person whose ancestors had gone from slavery to Reconstruction to, terrorism and the Jim Crow South and segregation, and then, moved to an urban place like Los Angeles where where black people weren't allowed to buy houses in some areas and were beaten by police officers in other areas, quite literally just for being black. And then from that through to not just the turmoil of the civil rights movement, but the influx of crack cocaine and mass incarceration and all of these sorts of things resulting in a situation to where, you've got to this day, and I know this because I've lived in these contexts, young people in inner city communities, particularly, some young black people who have gone their whole lives, and the only white people they know are frequently, police officers who, by virtue of the environment, feel they have to be a bit aggressive, and teachers in public schools who feel sort of overwhelmed by by lack of resources and just a massively sort of difficult social climate, and then social workers and people working for the county and so forth who are similarly kind of buried underneath an avalanche of need and difficulty. These are the only relationships some people of color have with white folks, and so this explains something that I've noticed in these inner city areas where, particularly in L.A., you've got people who live in the projects who've never been to the beach, even though it's 20 miles away. And I was there in Washington sitting in a room full of people who were, probably frequently from the East Coast, but in a real way, a lot of these folks were sort of closer to the beach in Santa Monica than some people of color who just live some miles away. So I told that story.
That's what I did on my Memorial Day.
You went to the beach?
I took a dip.
Yeah.
It was like a baptism.
Well, you're lucky to be in L.A. now.
So cold.
Yeah, right. You can't do that on the East Coast.
That's true.
It's much, right? Water's still warm around here. So I told that story, but then which met with the resonance of many in the audience. But then I tried to tell a parallel story about your young white Appalachian or your one young white rural voter, maybe from the Appalachian South or something like that, who'd voted for Donald Trump and tried to tell the story of a person whose own ancestors had been, treated poorly at the time of the Civil War, pressed into service by wealthy white plantation owners who didn't care for him, to fight against the North that was politically sort of dominated by Northern industrialists and so forth, who didn't care about that group of people either. A storyline that takes you through, generations of poverty in rural America and takes you to a point to where, coming out of the civil rights movement, there's this tendency to want to blame the bulk of America's kind of like racial prejudice and put it on the shoulders of people who are religious, people who are rural, people who are from conservative areas and so forth, without always recognizing the fact that, racial discrimination is a phenomenon across America in communities that were urban, communities that are cosmopolitan, metropolitan, and so forth. And, to try and basically make the point that people had, and that in our own current time, these white folks are folks who have suffered a great dearth of economic and educational opportunity. They're not represented in campus life, and their culture is not something that's celebrated in Hollywood or in the academy. And so we all have reasons to feel, in a certain sense, like the system isn't working for us, but what we need is to embrace love as kind of a transcendent value in the way that Dr. King articulated, to allow us to traverse the difference in these storylines and to tell a new story that brings all these things together. And so that was a message that definitely, I feel like it resonated in a powerful way with people who were hearing it. Some people were certainly frustrated with the idea that we could be called upon to love people with who we felt were kind of, our opponents or our enemies in a social or political context, people we feel are hurting us. How do I love the person from, say, you're a social progressive person of color? How do I love the person who voted for a president who is now threatening potentially to deport my relatives or whatnot? It's a tough question, but it gave me the opportunity to talk about the power of love and the way that Dr. King defined it as enabling us to reach out to the best in our opponent. Whether you're liberal or a conservative, the dynamic applies, I think.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, sir.
Well, first off, I should say everyone should go to YouTube and watch John's speech, because I think it's moving and groundbreaking in many respects.
Yeah, we'll try and have a link up sometime soon.
Yeah, hit that link. So what are the values beyond love that you think can unite Americans across these deep and meaningful ideological divides?
Well, I think that it is a combination of values and virtues that have to do so. There's a close relationship between the two. So on the level of values, I do think that what's core to American identity is a belief in the fundamental importance of liberty and equality, right? I think that freedom is something that we believe in kind of deep in our DNA as Americans. But I think that the belief in a meaningful equality is also about just as deep. And I think that part of what defines the American experience is the tension between differing sorts of, interpretations or conceptions in terms of how it is we realize, these ideals of freedom and equality. So, a more conservative person would tend to look at liberty and so forth and say that, well, this is my, particularly for more sort of libertarian-minded, that liberty is something that particularly expresses itself in my right to economic freedom and so forth, my right to open a business or to develop a certain enterprise, my right to sort of create a lifestyle for myself that is unencumbered by the regulatory kind of aggression of a bureaucratic state and so forth. But then the other side of liberty is also, and freedom is also sort of, lifestyle freedom, the freedom to be who you are in terms of, not just your religious beliefs, although definitely that, but also in terms of, your potentially your sexuality or expressing your kind of cultural sort of identity in a way that is highly sort of tailored to who you are. There's a wide range of sort of elements of liberty and freedom that, finds itself expressed in different proportions on different ends of the spectrum, and I feel like it's all valid. And then with respect to equality, there's this question of, is equality more meaningfully thought of in terms of equality of opportunity, or should there actually be some general level of equality with respect to economic outcomes? I think that people do feel like, equality of opportunity should lead to more equality in economic outcomes, not in a strict way, but enough to where people are all able to make good lives for themselves. But that's part of the liberal conservative, economic conversation over equality. And then obviously equality before the law, I think, is fundamentally something that goes to the heart of what Americans should be able to progress towards agreeing upon, even if there are different interpretations maybe of how we ultimately get there.
So when you talk about liberty and equality and how they're sort of, bone deep in American identity or embedded in our DNA, how do you think about the context in which the Constitution was written in terms of protecting and enshrining the rights of a relatively small group of people at the time, wealthy, white male landowners, essentially?
Well, I think that you have to distinguish between the ideals that were articulated in the founding documents and the sort of political and social realities of the time. I mean, that's certainly something that Dr. King did, right?
So you think those two can be sort of divorced?
Well, they can't be divorced in terms of understanding the reality of the historical context in which, these founding sorts of ideals were birthed. But they can be divorced in the sense of saying that ultimately the fact that these ideals were articulated in a context to where the execution of them fell so woefully short that does not prohibit us from being able to strive towards a more perfect expression of those values over time. So that gets
more perfect union.
Right, exactly. So that gets to the virtue component of this to me, because on a values side of things, I do think that liberty and equality, and there are other things we could talk about too, justice is a major part of that. But I do think that liberty and equality are certainly values that even though they're expressed differently on right and left on an idealistic sort of level, transcend them. But we have to pursue those values, I think, with virtue, and virtues like integrity and intellectual honesty, and what we've come to call patriotic empathy here at Better Angels. And ultimately, I see love as sort of being love in this social context. Love is goodwill, right? Agape love, which Dr. King exemplified and Arthur Brooks has more recently written about. I do see that as kind of a preeminent sort of virtue that can allow us to navigate the necessary tension in the conversation between the differing interpretations of these values, so as to allow us to develop a stronger and a more vibrant conception of what they look like in application over time. And I feel like that's part of what you and I tried to demonstrate a little bit in the context of our presentation to the Civil Discourse Club up at Lynn Benton Community College in Oregon.
Yes, and it also gave us the opportunity to run our brand new workshop, Depolarizing Within, which is sort of an interesting take on the whole question of polarization.
Why don't you break down really quick what we did up at Oregon?
Absolutely. So, to date, our workshops have really focused on two things. One is essentially intergroup interaction. Reds coming together with blues in a structured setting to build a place of trust and understanding that can hopefully reduce the animosity and depolarize.
Yeah.
The second thing we've been doing has been teaching skills and developing methodologies and ways of thinking about communicating across difference in a political context that can help people do that intergroup interaction. Yeah. So if you're a liberal and you want to go talk to your conservative friend or your conservative father or what have you, you can sort of arm yourself with these tried and tested Better Angels skills to go out and have that conversation to achieve disagreement, as we like to call it, sort of understand and clarify differences, illuminate commonality, take down the temperature, build a little bit of trust, try to maintain and deepen those relationships despite political differences that might otherwise threaten to damage the relationships, which is something I talked a little bit about with Ezra Klein, so let's put a pin in that. But so just to round this out, this new workshop we're doing is called Depolarizing Within, and it's sort of an interesting frame because it calls upon people to self-assess and sort of look inwards, look within to determine how polarized am I, how do I feel about how polarized I am, and do I and how do I depolarize?
Right.
And so we ran the workshop for the first time. We were very grateful to LBCC students, faculty, some local government officials for being our guinea pigs. And obviously, shouts out the grand Bill Doherty who designed this workshop.
Right.
And he's working on new ones too. We got more coming, so new heat on deck. So the way we do that is the first thing we do is that we ask people to essentially self-assess their level of polarization and their feelings toward the other side.
If you guys want to hear some more details about this too, you'll hear them in the most recent Johnalog episode that I recorded just before you got here. I kind of went down
the Johnalog,
gave a bit of a rundown on some of the depolarizing within questions. And
yes, and I think one thing that's important to emphasize is this, what we call the continuum of polarization, which ranges from hatred to disdain to pity to basic respect to respect and appreciation for other views. In any case,
this workshop gives you a chance to see where you fall in your own attitudes along that continuum, right? So provides a framework for a self-regulation of our own kind of internal conversation, one that hopefully will steer our internal dialogue away from the more sorts of, demonizing and vilifying tendencies of, our internal narrative that in turn, informs the way we interact with one another. So it's a powerful thing.
Indeed, it speaks to the power of stories. So it asks people to look inside and essentially say, what is the story that I'm telling myself about the other side in relation to myself? Right. And then we try to give people opportunities and methods to essentially edit that story. And one of the main ways in which we do that is we ask people to think about stereotypes. Obviously, there's defined sets of stereotypes that liberals feel conservatives hold of them, and vice versa. Blues will tend to say that reds think they are arrogant, elitist, maybe they favor big government for its own sake, fiscally irresponsible,
hate America,
unpatriotic, anti-religious, anti-free speech, politically correct, hypersensitive.
Snowflakes, man.
Snowflakes.
Can't handle the criticism.
Melting on the ground.
But then,
we got to do some, slam poetry at some point. And reds may tend to think that blues believe they're racist, anti-immigrant, uncaring about those in need, homophobic, anti-woman, anti-science, Bible thumpers. You guys all know the stereotypes. Then we say, how do you challenge these stereotypes? Here, I'll just give you a taste. Tell yourself that the other side is more varied than the stereotype. Acknowledge that their political views and motivations are no doubt more complicated than the rhetoric you've been hearing. Read and listen to thought leaders on the other side who present complex arguments. Recognize that the life experiences informing their views are likely different from your own. I think that one's key. Develop relationships with a variety of people who differ with you politically. Relationships tend to undermine stereotypes. That is unquestionably true. Anyway, I don't want to dive too deep. I don't want to spoil the workshop. There's a lot of cool stuff about making depolarizing distinctions, how to, sort of distinguish individuals from the stereotypes. In any case, it's a powerful workshop. It's one that can be done with audiences small and large, of mixed political composition. We're really excited about it. And we're grateful to LBCC for, just diving in with us.
Right. And the power of an exercise like that is in its ability to to a certain degree transform the individual and the individual's own attitude towards people of a differing perspective, and to arm people with a greater sense of confidence and understanding that we can take with us into our conversations and interactions with people of a strikingly different point of view.
It's almost like cognitive behavioral therapy, which makes sense given the therapeutic context of the development of this methodology. But go on.
Right, yeah. Well, yeah, there you go.
CBT.
There you go, kind of like that. And and we think that's important beyond even just sort of the therapeutic effect on the individual, because we tend to operate from the presupposition that this is something that this is a change that can take place in individuals that ultimately can sort of shift the norms of our interactions in a way that can scale up to influence the broader culture of American politics and our social society. And so that's something that you and Ezra Klein wound up talking about a bit in your own conversation. And I think Ezra made some very sharp points expressing a little bit of skepticism that's necessarily a viable strategy for larger political change, even if it might be beneficial in the context of one's own life. But I thought that was a terrific conversation back and forth that you guys had. I'm wondering how you were feeling about it, or if there's some things that stuck out about that dialogue to you.
Yeah, I felt really good about it. My thanks to Ezra for coming on. I know he's super busy. He's actually working on a book right now about politics, demographics, identity, polarization. So,
which I will be excited to read.
Likewise. And yeah, I think talking to Ezra was cool. I think the second half of the podcast is sort of where the meat is, and we talked about, can you separate political polarization from personal polarization from political polarization? Because I think Ezra thinks a lot about Congress and coalitions and parties and governmental norms and policy. And obviously polarization touches all of those things and is incredibly entrenched and, incredibly reinforced by tangled incentive structures that are going to be difficult to try to unknot. And then there's personal polarization, which is obviously also increasing. And in my mind, I think that you can tackle personal polarization directly and head on. That's what we do at Better Angels. And then the big question, right, is if we do that enough, if we scale it enough, will it filter up? Ezra is skeptical. I certainly understand his skepticism. One thing that I tried to do was just defend the value of the work, because I got the sense that he is very comfortable talking to people he disagrees with. Mm-hmm. He prides himself on that. He invites conservatives onto his show, and I think he seemed to be saying, well, maybe this problem's overblown, right? I mean, I talk to conservatives, and ultimately some people decide that their personal values and their political values are so important to their identity that they might want to pull back from a relationship. Mm-hmm. And I was saying that I think we've seen that this is getting worse and it's hurting relationships, and people are not feeling good about it. Right. And people are feeling unmoored and lost and angry and anxious and depressed. And I know I've felt that way. I know my friends have felt that way. Ezra tried to say, I think, that he thought, well, the reason that people are feeling that way is because of Donald Trump. And I think that's a bit of an oversimplification. I think obviously Trump is sort of looming over all of this. And I know, for liberals like myself, the day after the election, 2016, was a dark day. Mm-hmm. And that certainly had to do with Donald Trump. But I think at a larger level, just the breakdown in human empathy and compassion and for the better selves that we all strive to be, and just the nastiness and the fear. Anyway, I'm sort of getting off track, but we got deep. Funny. We got deep.
It was funny because as Ezra mentioned the fact that he's got tremendous political disagreement within his family, and that he was still able to have those conversations very well, which I totally believe. But at the same time, Ezra Klein is one of the most sophisticated political commentators. I mean, whether you agree with him on anything or not, he's one of the most sophisticated political commentators in America. If that's like the baseline level of conversational aptitude we need to manage those conversations, I think most of us are in trouble. And indeed, I think there is quite a bit of data just to start with, even before getting to personal anecdotes and things that have been related to us in the conversations you and I, Ciaran, have had with people on both sides of the aisle to make it clear that this is a problem that people are encountering. But Ezra did say something else that struck me as worth addressing a little bit, because Ezra seemed to be of the opinion, and I think a lot of people on the right and the left feel this way as well, which is that even though it is unpleasant for us to be disrespectful and rude to each other in the way that has kind of been increasingly sort of normalized in our conversational culture, it nevertheless may likely be the case that we need to adopt a certain sort of aggressiveness and even a willingness, perhaps, to...
Fury is the word he used.
Was that the word he used? Yeah, well, I guess a willingness to adopt a certain level of fury in order to advance social causes or political causes that ultimately need to be advanced. And so he seems to... He mentioned that there was some research to indicate that people who experienced a depolarization within, right? Maybe this would be the effect of some people going through a Better Angels workshop or something like that. But he seemed to say that people who found themselves depolarized were also became less likely to be actively committed to a social cause or to a political cause, because suddenly they were too quick to see the nuances and in other points of view, and therefore that keeps them perhaps from being as rigorously engaged in activism. And I thought that was an interesting point, and I imagine that there's something to that, because certainly one of the things that fuels activistic energy is sort of a sense that the moral truth of a certain issue is just so clear that there's no need to have any hesitation in running headlong in the direction of advocating for one thing, because there's just nothing redeeming to be said for either the point of view on the other side of a question, or even the people holding that point of view on the other side of a question.
Certainly makes it easier to maintain a single-minded focus on
well,
achieving a goal that you believe is unquestionably morally correct.
Right. But I do think, though, that this, for whatever degree of truth there is to that, I think that there's something in this that misunderstands a little bit of what it is we are striving for at Better Angels, ultimately. And that this sort of gets to the necessary distinction that needs to be made between sort of civility for its own sake and ultimately sort of, creating a culture of, again, what we term patriotic empathy that allows us to rediscover some common values and some common bonds that are more fundamental than our party affiliation or our political disagreements, that nevertheless leaves us free and able to challenge each other, perhaps even more vigorously, but also with more integrity in the context of the actual marketplace of ideas. And, this is why I emphasize love as a social value a little bit more than I emphasize, civility or politeness or etiquette and so forth. Because I do think that civility is, and, Ezra did mention Dr. King a bit too, and he mentioned King's letter from Birmingham jail as being an example of a moment where Dr. King seemed to, quote, abandon depolarization, where King embraced a polarizing way of talking about an issue in order to call out the white moderate
Right.
as being ultimately complicit in the injustice of segregation through his own apathy towards finding a solution to that problem. But I think that what needs to be emphasized is the fact that there is not a word in the letter from the Birmingham jail that King wrote that in any way contradicts Dr. King's overarching emphasis and commitment towards loving his enemies, towards loving his oppressor, towards loving the pro-segregationist, loving the racist, loving the person who he felt was enthralled to a destructive way of looking at the world or implementing political or social policy. And I think that it's important for people to realize that what it is we're striving for is genuine understanding of the depth and breadth of human experience, so as to allow us to release the burden of our contempt for one another. But that does not require you, Ciaran, to throw up your hands and say, okay, well, I guess I don't need to try and hold Donald Trump accountable for the things that I think he ought to be held accountable for, assuming that that your political feelings on Trump leaned in a certain direction. And it doesn't keep me from being able to say that, look, I understand why it is people support sort of a larger role for government in the direction of alleviating poverty and creating all sorts of means towards opportunity for marginalized people. But it doesn't prevent me from being able to see the humanity in that position, while still also feeling that so much of what the government does locks people of color and locks other disadvantaged and poor people into circumstances of dependence and circumstances of basically not being able to realize the American dream on account of the fact that government has a tendency to overstep its proper function. I can advocate for a smaller government without feeling any sort of contempt for people who would advocate for a larger government or a more aggressive government. But if I do feel contempt for them, that damages me personally. It also keeps me from being able to communicate with them so that we can find some common ground, right? So, I don't have to abandon my passion to see the humanity in my opponent. And there's something very practical, I think, in that, alongside the idealism that's obviously conveyed in that. So, that was my basic feeling in listening to your talk with Ezra Klein and the very understandable point that he was making.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like a lot of people don't want to abandon their contempt and their disdain.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting to dig into that a little bit, because I think people feel like abandoning their disdain for those for whom they have disdain would be kind of like sacrificing their ideals.
Right.
And obviously, I think this disdain toward opponents is increasingly tied up with people's identity.
Right.
And so transcending that disdain is a difficult process that takes a lot of self-work.
Right.
It's not easy to do.
Mm-hmm.
It's really challenging. And I think that was part of Ezra's pessimism. It's just tough work.
He's right.
But it is doable. And we find, I think, a lot of the people who come into Better Angels get more energized about politics and more hopeful and optimistic. But I do understand the point that when you become a little bit more humble, it might make it a little bit more difficult to be so full-throated and confident in your absolute moral supremacy.
Right. Well, I don't think that we need to be confident in our moral supremacy, so to speak, but I do think that we need to be confident in sort of, the supremacy of moral truth as an aim enough to allow us to be open-minded enough to other people's points of views to learn from them, while still holding to the convictions that we bring into a conversation, right? Because one of the reasons why you would even, from my vantage point, one of the reasons why you would even want to come to know the heart of your enemy, enemy, at least metaphorically speaking, your opponent here, is because you would want to be able to speak to that person in a way that could actually move that person. And even if it doesn't work in every conversation, it's an incredibly powerful skill to take with you through life, and it's not something you can do unless you're disciplined enough to see the human being behind the opinion, So obviously there's much more that we can say about that, but Better Angels is not anti-passion by any means, and we are here to make it more possible for people to commit to the things that they believe in politically and not less. So, with that, I say we go forth.
Yes, with vigor.
Indeed. All right, folks. This has been our recap for the week, and or for the month, maybe. We should do this more often.
Yeah, man. June is here. Summertime, baby.
Better Angels Convention, June 20th to 23rd, St. Louis. Mr. Hawk Newsom, Miss Lexi Hudson, Mr. Ken Bone. Going to be an interesting cast of characters, and we are looking forward to seeing some of you out there in St. Louis as well, charting the course towards depolarizing America and restoring the American identity. So with that, man, I say we say it do.
Peace.